All right, let's get started here. Welcome everyone to Big Mosquito. This is the second to last workshop in the PNW Forest Collaboratives workshop series. We're really excited for the webinar today. This series has been going on since April. We have 2 more webinars that'll go through October, and then we're hoping to host the workshop in person next year. So I hope everyone's excited for that. Before we get started, I need to thank our sponsors, specifically our silver sponsors today, Timberline Lodge, Hampton Lumber, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium, the Forest Service. I'd also like to go through some ground rules. Due to the large number of attendees and really to help you get the most out of today, we're asking you stay muted unless otherwise instructed. Please use the chat box to ask questions. It will be restricted to host, but if you'd like to introduce yourself and your organization, your location right now, that would be welcome. Please also keep your video off unless otherwise instructed. This helps with bandwidth and also limits distractions. There will be moments where we ask you to turn your video on, or if you're interested in turning it on, like asking a question and whatnot, we'll prompt you to do so. But again, please limit your audio and video unless we ask you to. Usually at the end of these workshops, we'll have about 15 minutes where we'll open breakout rooms. And that way you'll have a chance just to network with others. These are not facilitated, they're not required. We think of them as bumping into people in the hallway. So you can use that if you see someone on here you'd like to reach out to. There we go. And so now I'm just going to pass this over to Amanda Lindsay, who's going to help lead our discussion today.
All right, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you guys for showing up this morning and expressing interest in the East Fork Big Creek Riparian Monitoring project that we did on the Malheur. So we're going to talk about a project that was completed through the Big Mosquito project. We call it East Fork Big Creek. It's a riparian treatment project, and we'll go into all the treatments here in just a minute. But what we want to talk about today, there's 3 main topics we want to talk about today. The Big Mosquito project, like how we went through the planning process and how we worked through collaboration, how we developed these treatments, the actual treatments themselves, and then the monitoring, the design and the results that we're seeing based off of these treatments. So we're going to start with the Big Mosquito project. Can everybody see these slides? I guess I better make sure.
That works for me.
Okay, good. So as we started the Big Mosquito project, when we were just getting out to the woods, to look at the project area and to, start kind of assessing it, what we found and what was revealed to us was that we had differing ecological conditions on the ground than what we were seeing in the current literature. And specifically what I mean by that is we had quite a bit of cool moist forest or moist mixed conifer forest in this project area, but we were showing the ground was showing us that there was a lot of fire out there as well. You can't hardly walk around out there without seeing fire scars. And we were looking at the overstory structure, and it was predominantly in most places early seral, which didn't really match up with what we were seeing in the literature as far as moist mixed conifer forests having more of a mixed, severity fire regime for longer fire return intervals, and being dominated by either a mixed species or more late seral species. And so that led us to asking a lot of questions and to investigating into why we were seeing what we were seeing on the ground out there. We were also stepping into accelerated restoration as a forest. And we had some new leadership and some new direction for this project to take a holistic landscape restoration approach. And so what this meant was, we looked at all resources for restoration, and we looked, at the whole project area from the stream bank to the ridge top, instead of mostly focusing on vegetation and fuels in the past. Our purpose and need for the project really was to just maintain and improve resiliency to disturbance in the project area. This project was a high priority at the time because there are still remaining a lot of large old pine in the project area. And so it was a high priority to treat around those trees and to protect them. Some of the specific parts of the purpose and need, including restoring the forest structure, composition, and density, and that included, the uplands and the riparian areas, reducing fuel load and reducing fire hazard, and then also restoring degraded stream processes. So at this point in time, the collaborative, so we work very closely with the Blue Mountains Forest Partners Collaborative, was also, figuring out how to deal with accelerated restoration and wanting to work very closely with the forest on all of its projects. And so instead of going from collaborating on an individual project and kind of going out and having really in-depth conversations about very specific treatments or very specific areas that we wanted to treat, they broadened their approach to an issue-based approach. And so they were looking more at like controversial issues and learning more about them, and how do we kind of work through those issues. And so we started some of those conversations in the Big Mosquito project. Some of them included like moist conifer and riparian treatments. So as I mentioned earlier, we sought to understand the history of the project area. So how did the historical disturbance processes, shape the landscape? How did they shape the structure and the function of this forest? And so we collected quite a bit of data out there. We collected fire scars in the riparian areas and in the uplands by finding, stumps and down logs that we could saw into and get good samples from. We did some species composition reconstructions, both in the riparian areas and in the uplands, and trying to piece together, how long the trees had been there and what the species composition was, in the past. We also did some aerial photo interpretation with the 1939 photos. We mapped the high severity fire scars and the fire patches, and actually took those and digitized those in to GIS on the computers. The silviculture crew and the aquatics crew actually got together, and we developed some modified riparian stand exams. And so they were based off of upland forest stand exams that we used to collect upland forest veg, but we modified them to get at some of the questions that the aquatics group needed to answer for doing the riparian surveys and for doing riparian treatments. And so we looked at historical species compositions through those exams. And we also, looked at like some stream measurements and stream processes as well. And we also collected our stream surveys, that looked at things like, how much down wood do we have in stream reaches, and, measuring pools and riffles and stuff like that. So what we found was we saw very frequent fire based off of the samples that we collected. It ranged anywhere from a 3-year to 30-year return interval, and that's on individual samples. So it's not a full fire regime history, but it gave us an idea that, yes, we're looking at pretty frequent fire. We also saw changes in species compositions from historically being, in some places dominated by ponderosa pine, and in other places, much more of a mixed conifer with a good mix of species. We also saw that the high severity patch sizes in the whole Middle Fork landscape, were relatively small. approximately 50% of them mapped out to be 1 to 10 acres, and almost all of them were less than 100 acres in size. We also saw that there were very similar patterns in the uplands and the riparian areas. There wasn't a lot of differences that we saw. And we were asking the question, so why are we seeing what we're seeing here? Like, why is it different? And the conclusion that we came up to was that we have neighborhood effects going on. We have small inclusions, really, of moist mixed conifer and riparian area forest in a larger landscape of dry forests, and that the dry forests, the disturbance patterns were driving what was going on in the moist mixed conifer forests and in the riparian areas as well.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Bob Hastings Miller, and I had a chance to be the district hydrologist on this project, and gonna talk a little bit about some of these slides. Amanda, could you click that next one as well, please? And so, we took a hard look for the best available science for riparian processes and functions and management for these fire adapted riparian forests when we started. And like Amanda suggested, we didn't find a whole lot, and things were pretty different in our landscape. We did find a nugget in Jerry Cordova's master's thesis here. And he had done some studies in these watersheds, and he had observed a difference of in-stream wood compared with the types of species in the adjacent forest in both wilderness and unmanaged streams. And he observed patterns in seral status of the riparian forest to what we call valley confinement. And that's what we're showing here. And that's really a measure of the form of the valley and its ratio of the channel size to the valley size. And so he had observed that riparian stands in these unconfined, and then in the middle, there's these moderate confined valley types. He had observed a pattern that they were 2 to 3 times higher volume of early seral tree species. And so, we started looking at it from our riparian, kind of our valley processes. And we were starting to hypothesize that the topography drove fire behavior, and that we were having more of the low severity fire in these more open valleys. And so these pieces, these lines of evidence were starting to fit our landscape, and in particular, the riparian areas. And we were starting to see and be informed with telling the story. Next slide, Amanda.
You're on mute. Did you mean to do that?
No, it was me. Sorry. I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay. So as we started planning the riparian treatments in Big Mosquito, there was a team that got together. It included a fish biologist, a hydrologist, a silviculturist, and a fuels planner. And we really worked together to develop these treatments. We modeled the riparian treatments off of the upland treatments with some minor differences. And so some of these differences included, we had smaller openings in the riparian areas versus the uplands. The opening placement where we were looking at putting openings changed. In the uplands, we were looking at areas that we wanted to regenerate early seral species. So like dense patches of young brand fir were where we tried to place the openings. In the riparian areas, we actually tried to center them around places that already had existing hardwoods. And that was to be able to hopefully see a response in the hardwoods afterwards, to open them up and let them grow and regenerate. We also had higher target densities in the riparian areas versus the uplands, because we would expect that these areas would be more productive, and we had a higher proportion of leaf patches in the riparian areas than we did in the uplands. So we worked very closely with the collaborative through this whole entire process, and with other partners as well, to develop the treatments. We did a lot of science forums, riparian workshops, field trips, And we had a lot of discussions with the whole collaborative and then with subcommittees as well. And work very closely with the collaborative to develop what we're calling the Riparian Restoration Zones of Agreement. And that kind of just outlines like where we have, where we've discussed different treatments and where we have agreement that, that those are appropriate treatments to take on the landscape.
All right. And we had 2 sets of riparian workshops, and really grateful for the Blue Mountain Forest partners for being intentional about bringing scientists to the table to learn and create the shared learning atmospheres. And these were some of these great folks that shared their perspectives with us and our collaborative. Up in the top left, we have Gordy Reeves, and he was really paramount with wanting to see us get it right. And we can't thank Gordy enough. He shared, working manuscripts. He shared NetMap licenses with us so we could get the treatments in the right places and really get our perspective on RHCAs. And, he really illustrated that we needed to restore characteristic fire patterns in critical stream reaches where shading really matters using GIS solar radiation models. And he framed it for us. We only had an opportunity to treat so many areas. So it really mattered. And we needed to make it count where we had some management intervention. Chris Jordan, he showed us some beaver restoration and how to restore water table dynamics, and provided some of those perspectives in the sharing. Steve Wanzel, a researcher here in the Pacific Northwest, helped inform us of legacy conditions and really some of the past practices since 1860 that have really impacted these stream and riparian areas that we're working. And he showed us how much management is really needed to make a dent. And he kind of framed that with the term management inertia. He also showed us that shading certain portions of the low gradient rivers was the most important action to prepare steelhead and salmon for climate change. And then we had Paul Hesberg here, and he was not timid about what we needed to do to restore patterns and processes of landscapes, including RHCAs. Paul really challenged our thinking paradigms of sitting back and allowing riparian areas to function without intervention. And then last, not pictured here, was Jerry Cordova. Jerry also came in and shared with us, and he shared that there was really a difference between the observed in-stream and adjacent forest, and that tree species really matter from a decay standpoint for influencing valley morphology. Jerry Cordova used to work on the district and as a fish biologist, and when he did NEPA prior to packfish and fish, he illustrated some of the problems that he was working on. And at that time, the practices were clear cutting down to the stream bank edge. And so Jerry framed our ecological forestry practices and RHCAs as good problems to have compared to some of the management regimes that used to be out there. And so just really thankful for, some of the perspectives that we learned from. And I guess last, between Gordy and Wanzel, we learned, how our forest plan looked at things like riparian management objectives, or RMOs, from our forest plan. And those were designed from a standpoint that, all of the forested stands next to the streams were old growth stands. And that's what the RMO levels were for things like wood, pools, undercut banks, and shade. And since then, Steve Wanzel's developed some state and transition models that have suggested to us that it might be more like 50% of old growth forests along streams. And so really learning how to apply that HRV to some of these cascading processes is terribly important. And last but not least, I needed to thank Sustainable Northwest for being a large player in those science workshops and for these. And Sustainable Northwest has just added a tremendous amount of value to these processes for us. And so we're grateful. Next slide, Amanda. Can you go ahead and click it one more time, please? Thank you. Walking streams and understanding patterns is a wonderful time for the fish biologists and hydrologists. But this time, like Amanda suggested, we brought along silviculture, fuels, and we brought some ecologist folks out with us to really better understand how disturbance processes influenced riparian patterns. And so over here in this left photo, we observed how an insect and disease patch created an opening. We observed how the opening had abundant downed wood. It had a nice flush of hardwoods, and where the water tables were higher, there were sedges present. But we didn't really see the scale of disturbance processes happening in our landscape until we really started working on some of the fires. And through some of the bear teams that we had worked on, we had observed how areas changed over time. And then in the bottom right, we would get telephone calls from the county road department, and they would tell us that 2 feet of mud got deposited on the so-and-so road, and that we would run out there and we would really look at the bear burn severity maps. We would look at some of our debris flow models, and when we would really see some of the patterns of how these processes were functioning from thunderstorms to really create these pulses of disturbances within these systems. And that disturbance that really drives the system for wood loading, hardwoods, and patch mosaics. But, as we were working through the information as an ID team, scale, it kept coming back to our minds. Amanda? And so, these images from other presentations started floating in, and they started looking at that patch size and the spatial patterning of what it might have looked like historically. And really the wood recruitment and those hardwoods and these processes that drive these riparian systems are really a time since disturbance process. And we were beginning to understand how fire suppression was really connecting these fuel accumulations. And we were seeing the patterns like in the bottom right and the Canyon Creek fire and a lot of these other more current day fire. The patterns were much larger and more severe with impacts. And so we kept learning from the fire reconstructions, and they were just becoming more and more interesting to us in understanding how these pulsed disturbances work through these systems. Next slide. We looked at some engineering solutions when we first started walking streams in John Day. Mainly what we were seeing is a lot of over engineering and log weirs and things to trying to restore streams. And so really our first principal strategy came from Dave Powell, and he's contributed a monster pile of white papers. And he has a riparian white paper in which he describes, if we can emulate or mimic disturbance processes to maintain high ecological integrity. And so that really popped to us. And that's the setting where we wanted to mimic those fire disturbances within these forested riparian areas. And then, in some of these other areas, the non-forested, we really wanted to mimic beaver dams and try to restore those water tables. And we felt that, working with nature, we could maintain higher benefits. And that really had a lot of positive insight for us. The next bullet, in restoring resilience and resistance to characteristic fires, we needed those early seral trees to be released. And we really needed to accentuate them as an asset. We spent a lot of time with our chief, with some of our environmental partners, and I see some are present today, thank you. And we really wanted to share our perspective, and we wanted to hear theirs. And so we're grateful for the time that we had to spend with the Blue Mountain Biodiversity Project and the time that they had a chance to spend with us. And we really began understanding some of their concerns about, really leaving these leaf areas that were denser and they would have been more grand fir, but really concentrating them in the patches. And so some of those things really started coming out for us. Next, we treated RHCAs differently across our landscape. We really didn't want a one size fit all. And so there's different productivity gradients in our moist forests than the dry forests. And we really wanted to set up some of those processes differently. So we had that. And here, this is what this is kind of the mosaic that I think is just absolutely lovely that we tried to create in the diversity of conditions across the RHCAs as an example. Okay, next slide. Legacy activities of fire suppression and past timber management, they've left a mark on the conditions of riparian areas and their ability to function. A lot of folks in the natural resource group, aquatics and wildlife, they tend to be pretty sensitive to management in our RHCAs. These places have really high productivity because they have deeper accumulations of Mazama ash and a wonderful supply of groundwater. These riparian areas are our biodiversity hotspots. But we manage those areas heavy, in the past, and they've been impacted. And so, why are we treating? we really wanted to add wood to these systems that were deficient of wood in a degraded condition. Wood down there in the Bankful Channel, it does so much to these processes of connecting the stream with the floodplain, promoting hypereic flow. And in the process of saturating these banks, we get more riparian dependent species that start popping out of the soil because of that elevated water table. And gosh, we learned back in 2011 really what the impacts of wood did. And we added large wood to a stream reach, and ODFW had studied it, and there were 800 juvenile steelhead before. And we increased it by 500 to 1,300 per 100 meters by adding wood. And so wood complexity to these systems does so much. You know, it creates the structure and it provides a tremendous amount of habitat. Okay, can you click, please? But also what we were seeing is in the absence of disturbance, the canopy conditions were closing in and hardwoods were no longer being favored along the stream system. And so we had a lot more decadent shrubs out there. We were beginning to see that DEQ was adding these new 303D listings for biocriteria. And we were thinking about food webs of aquatic invertebrates from leaf fall of hardwoods. And, you know, we really wanted to restore that mosaic and patchwork of process. Okay, next slide, please. And so here is East Fork Big Creek with, on the right side, the 19 polygons mapped representing our openings. 3 of these were not harvested because they were part of the study that you'll hear about in a minute, and they were the controls, which are showing up in yellow here, which left 16 openings that occurred on East Fork Big Creek, ultimately ranging in size from 1/4 to 1 acre. And they occurred across a variety of valley confinements. And the prescription of the opening was about 10 to 20% of the total RHCA, retaining 0 to 40 square feet of basal area, and really leaving all old trees and the healthier specimens of these trees listed on the left. Those were really how we wanted to improve the species composition through these patches. Okay, next slide. Thank you. And here are some pictures of visuals of what our treatments look like, in which we restored both stand structure and really opened up around some of the hardwoods. And, you know, again, a lot of the materials that were felled through this pilot project were retained out there on site. And so it allowed for some good conversations regarding fuels. Next slide. Thank you. All right, this is how we structured our analysis in the NEPA and framed the monitoring. So thinning would decrease canopy closure and shade to allow light to reach the understory. We treated the canopy in patches to increase riparian hardwoods and increase age class and extent along the streams. And that water temperatures may warm locally, but we will likely not see a response at the sub-watershed outlet, primarily due to the patchy nature of these activities. And the wood that we thinned, it was directionally felled towards the stream to promote wood loading, pool development, and all those other riparian processes that we talked about, but also to jack straw materials and make it more challenging for ungulates to access young hardwood growth. And all of this, we work closely with our DEQ basin water quality basin manager to understand these developments. And he really framed for us that, you know, we're restoring these processes and really stated that, you know, the lateral bank storage of reconnecting floodplains is so critical for restoring watershed hydrology and really restoring that sponge of the landscape. And, you know, there are consequences of treating, but there are also benefits, you know, decreasing shade over the short term for improving the stand's ability to handle fire, drought, insects, and disease, while restoring wood for those processes. And it was really starting to feel restorative, aligning the riparian patchwork to the fire and drought processes that were showing themselves. Okay, next slide.
Okay.
Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. It's sometimes very sensitive where you get back on accident. So Amanda and Bob gave a really great background of how they arrived at actually doing these treatments. And by the time I arrived on the scene in the Blue Mountains, we implementing the treatments, and my predecessor had already talked to Bob and Amanda and set up this monitoring. So this is literally where I come in, not just in the implementation, but also in the implementation of the veg monitoring. Next slide, please. So what we decided to use for the veg monitoring is a riparian vegetation monitoring protocol, where you actually look at the vegetation across the valley. So not a lot of monitoring protocols in riparian areas focus just specifically right along the stream or in the stream. And for what these treatments were trying to achieve, we really needed to use a protocol that could capture the vegetation across the riparian zone and the zones that were influenced by the stream. And so what we decided to use was Dave Merritt's protocol here. It's now since been published, but at the time that we did the initial baseline surveys, it was still in draft mode, and we actually were able to provide some feedback, testing out some of the different aspects of the and at its core, it is a before-after control impact study design. So that means that you collect baseline data, and then the treatments get implemented, and then you follow the vegetation for years afterwards. And what that lets you do is kind of take out the portion of natural variation and change that might occur over time, because you also have controls that you're following. And so the change in controls is obviously not a treatment effect. Let's see. And then we also stratified where we did our monitoring reaches by slope and valley confinement. So along the creek here, it goes from sort of higher gradation and narrower confinement to lower in elevation in the wider openings, the valleys where they're wider, and the stream gradient is a little deep. Next slide there, Amanda. So on the left here, we actually scanned in one of our field notebook pages, because I thought this was a good example of sort of a schematic of how inside each one of these treatment areas and or control areas, this is how we set up the transects. So each monitoring reach, as we were calling it, has 7 to 9 transects, and you can see on the notebook there, they're going perpendicular to the direction of the valley. And these notebooks, the reason why we have such a detailed schematic is because you can imagine that finding the transect endpoints, again, we did stake them, but particularly in the treatments where there's sort of pickup sticks of downed wood at this point, these schematics and the detail in which the text did this actually was really useful in finding those transects again for the repeat measurement. So some of the things we collected on these transects: tree species, canopy cover, basal area, shrub species and canopy cover, and herbaceous species. And we also collected landform data. So along the transects, how the landforms changed, whether we were in stream, active floodplain, secondary active floodplain, or old terraces. And then we also collected streamside shade, or actually not streamside shade. We actually collected the shade in the middle of the channel. And that's the data that I'll be showing you. Just in that inset picture there, that's just a reminder of the controls, and the black are the treatment polygons, and that's where this setup of 7 to 9 transects occurred. Next slide, please. So I want to note that, excuse me, the data that you're seeing in these next few slides from the first post-treatment collection. So that's in 2019. And so it's already been a couple years. Things may have changed a little bit more. The next time that we are sampling again is next year, I believe. And you'll see for what this graph shows, the next graphs they're set up pretty much the same way. So they'll have year on the x-axis, and then whatever the metric of interest is on the y-axis. And in this graph here, what this is showing is basal area of large trees in 2016 and 2019. And this is to show you the effect of the treatment, or the sort of the measurement of the treatment. And so you can see here in the treatment reaches 6.5, 10, and 14, there was a 37%, 57%, and 35% reduction in basal area in those treatment reaches. And the reason why we're kind of looking at change is because these reaches are pretty different, and these reaches are intended to be sort of paired. So 6.5s are together, the 9 and 10 are together, and the 13 and 14 are together. And that's because of the difference in their valley confinement and stream gradient. Okay, next slide. And the error bars, I should say, those black error bars that show you how much variation there is just naturally. So this slide here, it's the same setup, only we're now looking at density. And again, that's just to give you an idea of the measurement of the treatment. So density is trees per acre. So, and you can see in the treatment reaches how much was removed in terms of trees per acre. The average, I should say, average trees per acre. Next slide. And these next 3 slides are actually, I have to thank my colleague, Amarina Winchell. She's the one that produced these. And also mention that she's actually the person that's going to take the lead on the veg monitoring going forth. She's the new ecologist in the Blue Mountains. And for herbaceous cover, all of the data that I'm showing you now, even though the transects, actually the tree transects went across the entire RHCA, so 300 feet out from the middle of the stream, what I've been showing you is actually just on what we consider the riparian zone. So that's just out the edges of the old terraces. So not necessarily not to the edges of the active floodplain, because that's pretty narrow. We wanted to capture out to the edges of what is possible as a floodplain, and hopefully one day, especially in the lower gradient valleys, might actually end up being reconnected. So real quickly here, this is the herbaceous cover overall in that riparian, and so you can see that there hasn't really been a whole lot of change in the herbaceous cover. And keep in mind that vegetation takes a really long time sometimes to respond. There's also a lot of variation in vegetation, and so it's pretty hard to sometimes pick up a signal until a few years have passed. Next slide. So this is we out the herbaceous cover into, we just are now looking at the wetland species, the wetland loving and water loving species of the herbaceous species that are out there, especially in degraded streams that are where the floodplain has been disconnected from the stream itself. And so the floodplain is actually pretty dry. over time, over decades of this, of the floodplain being disconnected, you will actually start to get upland species on the floodplain where there used to be more wetland species. And so we're trying to track here by pulling out the wetland species. We are trying to track whether, as these treatments reconnect floodplains, whether we can see an increase in the wetland species cover over time. And again, vegetation is variable. It takes time. We don't actually, know whether the floodplains have been completely connected again or not. It's only, as at the time of this data, it was only 3 years post-treatment. The other thing I would say is that this is a summary across the entire riparian zone of wetland species, and it's possible that if we were to further drill down, since we collected data on the different landforms, we're able to tease out the wetlands. We're able to tease out cover by landform. So if we were to tease it out a little bit more and actually just whether the wetland species increased on the immediate active floodplains or the next level of floodplains, we might actually be able to see more of a change. And that's something that I think, I'll be looking at in the future, just to see if right now we might not be seeing, not be detecting a change just because we're looking across that entire valley. Next slide. And then this is one of the objectives, the increase in shrubs and tree hardwood cover, excuse me. And again, the hardwood cover was really variable, even more so than the herbaceous species. And you'll even notice here, we're not actually displaying all the reaches, and that's because the treatment reach for 6.5 for the really narrowly confined reach, that one didn't even have any hardwoods to show yet. Well, it didn't previously, and it didn't now either. So, so hopefully something will pop up there soon. But that's a very forested setting compared to the other paired reaches. Next. So the treatments generally reduce the large and small tree densities. I didn't show you the small tree density slides. It reduced basal area of those large trees. And it did actually, another slide I didn't show you was that it increased the average size of the residual large trees. In other words, we took down a lot of the small trees, and what was left over were the big desirable species and the bigger trees. There was also a reduction in grand fir basal area and the small tree density. I just mentioned that. So again, and then in general, there was an increase in herbaceous cover over time, but it wasn't because of the treatments necessarily. It was just, that's what happened after 3 years. And so far, there's been no significant differences in hardwood cover. So stay tuned, because we intend to follow the vegetation and how it responds to these treatments for, I would hope, at least 10 years, but maybe longer. Next. So the other thing we measured was shade. And here's an image of the device that we use to measure shade. So this is called a solar pathfinder. And we placed that solar pathfinder in the middle of the stream, got it level, and you can see that you can see actually the shade on the plastic, kind of like a dome over it. And the grid lines that you see are actually different paths that the sun will take for different months. And so we were looking at the August month. That's kind of we chose August as the sort of the month that has the highest accumulating heat load. And what you do is you just see what the shade is as this traveling throughout the day, and then kind of get a sum of the shade. And so for this one, you can see just an example here in treatment 6.5, Transect 1, there was 85% shade in 2016, and then when we revisited that in Oh, sorry. And then there's apparently, oh, we took that. Sorry, I apologize. This picture is just showing two different measurements on Transect 1. So what we did was take, for an entire reach, we actually took 10 measurements of shade going along the entire monitoring reach in the middle of the stream. So next, please. So to try to display that, to just kind of give you an indication of how much variation there is, what I did was try to display the distribution of the 10 points for each reach. So this slide, again, the x-axis is year, the y-axis is shade percent, but the graph itself looks a little bit different. This is called a box plot. And so what you're seeing is the distribution of those 10 measurements. And the black thick line that's going horizontally across the box is the median. So that's the median shade percentage. And then the top of the box is the 75th percentile. The bottom of the box is the 25th percentile. And then if you see individual points, those are actually kind of outliers. So those are, those are measurements that are really outside the main distribution of the rest of the points. And again, this is just to show you the huge variation in the shade measurements, because if you think about it, we're going along the stream measuring shade, and depending on what's there at any point, there could be a branch, there couldn't be a branch, there could be downwood after the treatment, there couldn't be, so it's highly, highly variable. And the best thing to look at is that median line to see whether, what happened. So that dark black thick line is the best line to look at. And you can see that the median did go down in the treatments, but it also went down in the controls. So what's going on there? Trees and shrubs die, things get fallen over, storms happen. It's really hard. This is actually, I think, a pretty hard one to get a handle on because of all the variation. Okay, so next slide. So some of the things that we noticed was definitely that the shade got more variable as you went towards less confined valley. So the shade distribution was higher and also more compact in the more forested setting. And then once you got into the more unconfined valley, then it was really variable because you had, a tree over a part of the reach, or maybe two trees over the reach, as opposed to in the forested setting where you had pretty consistent shade. So as far as shade and stream temperature goes, we might need to be a little bit more concerned in the unconfined valleys in terms of doing some thinning where there's not a whole lot of shade to begin with, and so the shade that is there might be more important. Next slide. Okay, and this is where I turn it over to Bob.
All right. And yeah, so we wanted to know what that treatment effect was. And then we also wanted to know how shade would be impacted over time. And then we further wanted to march that down to water temperatures. And so here, this is how we monitored water temperatures, fairly heavy throughout East Fork Big Creek and down to the Forest Service property boundary on Big Creek. And so we deployed probes at these road junctions to get them pretty distributed throughout. In retrospect, we probably had too many probes. But as you'll notice, East Fork Big Creek 5 is upstream, most upstream of the treatments. And then East Fork Big 1 is the most downstream of the treatments. Okay, next slide, please. And so we implemented the treatment in around August of 2016. And so here's some of those water temperature data sets for 2016 in blue and 2017 in orange. And so the top left diagram is for East Fork Big 5. And so again, that's the most upstream. To the right, B is the next one down, and so on to the mouth and the bottom left, that's East Fork Big 1. And so we really did not see a large signature tied to the openings and increase of the solar radiation to these treatments and the water temperature. And I guess what's important here is the red line is illustrating we have 52.6 degree. That's the DEQ water temperature standard. And so this is a bull trout stream, and it's a bull trout standard all the way down to Big Creek 1. And so the temperatures do exceed the water temperature standards throughout these sites, but we really did not see a large signature or increase following the treatments. And we were really intrigued by that. Okay, next slide. And so I think in wrapping our presentation up, we have some lessons learned or teachable moments that I think through the process of this, the planning, the pilot treatments and monitoring, I think there's a few things that really flushed to the surface that we felt like we really wanted to share. And the first one is hardwood processes take time, and growth and germination are processes that, the monitoring on a 3-year schedule, that was likely a bit too aggressive. Pam, I see you have a comment down there. Will there be? Yeah, we did do some additional water temperature measurements in 2020 and didn't see a large change. And unfortunately, I'm no longer with that district, and I would love to advocate for future monitoring of water temperatures, but unfortunately, it's something outside of my control. Yeah, and so the hardwood processes, they take time. And really, we did the canopy opening, but I think really some of these processes we need to do as well as we need to consume some of the duff that's accumulated over time to create these germination sites for the hardwoods to really get established and expand and extent. And so I think 6 years might be a better time process for monitoring hardwood change and also looking at some of those treatments. And the second bullet, we had a really hard time developing a monitoring schedule to account for the veg treatments and fuel treatments. With some of the accelerated restoration that was happening in John Day on the Malheur National Forest, there was a backlog of projects of non-commercial thinning and prescribed fire that were being worked on. And so here we actually applied for an OWEB grant to implement this study. And we implemented the pilot treatments with forest account crews. And so we got some of this non-commercial thinning done very early in the process, and maybe even 5 to 10 years before we get some of the prescribed fire on the ground. And so really monitoring those processes and aligning for those, it's been really hard to do, but it's something that needs to be promoted. The thermal sensitivity of streams, that's something that we learned through these treatments. We really thought that we would see some type of solar radiation impact on the water temperature as the water temperature went through the sites. We really thought that we would see something. And it seemed like this stream, East Fork Big Creek, was not as much tied to the solar radiation as it was to some other air mass, air temperature processes. And, in looking at this and looking at the monitoring results and then working with Steve Wanzel and some researchers, they observed some of the same things on some of the clear-cut treatments that they did in Olympia, Washington. And so different land types and different landforms have different signatures for water and different thermal regimes. And some of our folks over in Boise, Dan Isaac, they're starting to publish papers that we have about 2 or 3 different types of thermal regimes over here. And what I learned is I believe these things are more resistant or resilient to solar radiation changes than perhaps a system that might be more snow melt driven with its hydrology and water temperature regime. For down wood, this was a big lesson learned for us. We had a collaborative work. So we had the science workshops. We had collaborative field trips where we went out and we marked the trees and what the treatments would look like. But then we also had another collaborative monitoring field trip where we went out to these openings after they were done and we talked about them. And it is just amazing how Ed Clark, the fuels planner for the district, opened our eyes very gently and suggested, Bob, some of the trees that you felled, you dumped them around the base of these larger trees that you're trying to promote on the landscape. And Bob, I'm concerned, if you leave this like this, we might get fire effects that kill these trees. And so I started opening my eyes to his perspective. And I started seeing, hey, maybe we don't want to leave so many heavy fuels around the base of these trees and maybe concentrated across the landscape in the ways that we did. And maybe that down wood might be an opportunity for us. And that's when Amanda Lindsay, we had some 15-inch grand fir that were, within the drip line of these beautiful clumps of ponderosa pine. And Amanda, gently pointed out to me, Bob, that's a commercial product there. And so I guess what we then started internalizing is, how are we going to design this whole process to get this work accomplished? And how are we going to pay for this work? Because through some of these processes, we were advocating for a lot of non-commercial thinning. And it was becoming clear to us that we really needed to restore some of these patterns across the riparian area. And so, we just continue to scratch our heads with how we're going to get this accomplished in a bigger picture. And then Amanda?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the process that we went through, to understand the landscape, to collect the data, to develop the treatments, and then working with our partners and the scientists and everybody that we worked with is very important if you're going to try a project like this or try something new on your forest. And it really can't be skipped. That's where you really, you learn and you develop the relationships, to work with people and to try new things. And so I guess I would just caution people that, that would want to take something like this and just apply it to their forest without really giving it a hard look and doing the background work as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys. I guess that is the end of our presentation. So we wanted to open it up for questions. And Sally, if you had some instructions about that as well.
Sure. A couple questions had come in the chat and I sent those to you guys. You want to start with them, and then for anyone else who has questions, please send them to me in the chat box and I'll make sure the presenters get them.
Do you want questions only in the chat, Sally, or can anyone ask? Anyone
can ask a question in the chat for now. Let's start with the ones that have come in through the presentation, and I put them in that Google Doc we have going. And if we finish those, then we can open it up.
So I see the first question is, will this presentation be made available? And I can definitely send it to Sally after we're done here to distribute and make available.
I see the second question relates to Chris Jordan's contact information regarding beaver information. And yes, I can put you in touch with him. He is, if I can email you that information, I'd need to look it up, but he works for NOAA and is a conservation biologist. And he ultimately put us in touch with an Oregon working group for beaver, that it's fairly well organized and such. And so, yeah, we can get you that information.
Bob, I think there's a question here that you would probably be best to answer. It says, did the observed debris flows show up in locations identified by bear assessment?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we were looking at, we were first looking in the Murderers Creek area and the rail fire areas for some of the debris flows that we were just beginning to see. And at that time, the USGS debris flow models weren't really mainstream as part of the BEAR process. And those have since come on since 2015. And so what we were using net maps, debris flow models, and really looking at the patterns of those. And those are different than what USGS uses. And so there is a little bit of a difference, but yeah, my recommendation is to look at both of those if you can.
Okay, the next question is there impact in these opened areas from livestock and or ungulate grazing? If so, would you speak to the degree and also long-term considerations for mitigation of this? I guess I'll start with that. We were, Bob and I actually went out a couple weeks ago and looked at the openings that we did the monitoring on and took some pictures and stuff. And yes, there is a little bit of impact. It looked mostly like deer and elk browse on some of the shrubs. I think the lower treatment plot may have had a little bit more cattle impact, but it was pretty minor. It was just kind of like some nibbling here and there. So, and Bob, you can speak to what you saw as well.
Yeah, we heard those concerns as we were continuing to build these pilot projects and moving into the next landscape project of Camp Lick. And we were told things like, yeah, all of the hardwood games that you're opening up are going to be browsed back down by ungulates. And so that was a concern of ours. And so we wanted to go out, and we went out in Big Mosquito to these pilot areas and walked around a lot of the openings. And our initial observations were when we felled the trees initially, they were standing up pretty high, and it really created a barrier. We're felling them pretty dense, and critters were not going into them. They were hard to get into. But as some of those branches came down, I guess we did, as Amanda just suggested, did see a couple, but more wildlife signs coming in into these areas. And so I don't believe we saw a lot of those impacts. And since then, we've had some conversations with Mike Wisdom, and they've done some studies out at Starkey at looking at the level of down wood across a few different treatments for looking at impacts to hardwoods from ungulates. And so really impressed that there is some science out there as well dealing with some of these things. And I think we really need to work with the cattlemen as well. And, if they're salting right next to places where we're doing openings, or if they have things that are concentrating cows to those places, maybe we can ask them to do things a little bit differently during that period. But yeah, didn't really see a whole lot of impacts.
So the next question is, what are the plans for prescribed fire in this reach? So we are planning on doing prescribed fire in this reach sometime in the future. There's still other upland treatments that need to be finished beforehand, and hopefully we can finish the variable density riparian thinning as well. And so it is a ways out still. I believe the planning document allowed for I can't remember if it allowed for backing fire into the RHCA or if we could directly ignite in the RHCA. I'd have to look that up. But a lot of our planning documents now, allow us to directly ignite within the RHCA a certain distance from the stream. So the next question is a question for Bob. And it says, can you talk a little more about the thermal regimes and what makes one regime more sensitive than another to solar heat loading? You mentioned snowmelt influence as one potential factor. Are there other factors, and can they be used to identify the most sensitive streams?
Yeah, so in their published paper, they do have it mapped out, but they don't have it in a GIS products yet that's accessible for us. But I think through doing some water temperature measurements, they kind of inform where these processes are. And so these systems that we were working in, they are, this feature, the land type feature, is like a large landslide. And so the situation is, it's kind of as if the groundwater is contributing to the stream channel, in which we call that a stream is gaining through these areas. And it's gaining deeper cold water. And this just has a different pattern in my mind than a stream that has a lower elevation, that, all of its water source is responsive snowmelt runoff. And in those conditions where the water temperatures might be 65 to 70, kind of within that realm, I think those ones are a little bit more sensitive to impacts with the canopy than these colder water systems. And ultimately, what we were trying to do with some of our treatments and best management practices is really limit the overall percentage of openings that can occur, within some of those different watersheds. And so if you have them that are sensitive, we don't really want to shock the system all in 1 year. And so if there's a way in which we can unfold the treatments in proportions instead of, all in 1 year, to allow for some of these other responses to come in. That's kind of how we wanted to try to break up some of those processes.
Okay, the next question is, what might be recommended if you lack pre-disturbance data for riparian sites and it is not possible to collect data from an analogous site? So, and for, an example would be following large high severity wildfire.
Do you want me to take this one, Amanda?
I think you would probably be the most appropriate to answer it.
Well, yeah, so that's an interesting question and a very good one. And obviously most of the situations that we find ourselves in, right? We had an opportunity with the treatments going in to make sure we collected some baseline. And I actually have something to say about baseline for that last question. But in this case, it's truly a monitoring situation where you're just following the response to some major disturbance. And you've probably would have the same kind of objectives in terms of like trying to follow and make sure that there's hardwoods coming up, and that there's appropriate tree regeneration and that sort of thing. And I think in this case, the monitoring would more maybe inform managers on whether they want to help the system recover, plant some hardwoods if there aren't any that look like they're coming up, or if there are ones that are coming up, help them along by keeping ungulates away, that kind of thing. I think that in this situation, monitoring is more about maybe directing management as things are recovering, as opposed to in our situation with big mosquito, the modern monitoring protocol that we used was pretty rigorous and in specifically trying to pick up treatment differences. And so the level of what you would measure and how you would measure, I think doesn't have to necessarily be that rigorous when it comes to just following recovery. Sometimes if you're following recovery and it's actually going really well, if there doesn't seem to be a problem, sometimes photo monitoring can be the best thing and easiest, just to get some temporal pictures. That's the best I can do with that. And that is the reality of most of the type of monitoring that land managers do.
So the next question is, will the monitoring plan incorporate measuring first and second order fire effects following prescribed fire?
I don't know. We haven't really talked about this part yet. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I think it should. I think, we want to see change in these systems, and I'm not exactly sure what those first and second order fire effects are following, but I really would like to see the response following that disturbance process, given the robust monitoring design that's set up out there.
I agree. It would be really great to follow that. It's, for us to do this in-house, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to find the manpower. Because of the way it's set up, it does require quite a bit of time and, people hours. So this is something that we might want to collaborate a little bit more on with either this group or with some researchers, maybe get a grad student. That's a really great way to get some data collection done. Something like that could be a pretty good master's for someone. Those are my thoughts.
So I see one other question in the chat that I don't think we addressed yet, and that is, how did the IDT develop their objectives for Downwood? Bob, could you cover that one?
Yeah, for that one, it's really interesting for the forest plan. We have packfish and fish, which are pretty coarse, and that utilizes the old growth RMOs. And then we have an amendment 29, which utilized desired future conditions for different forest types. And so that had wood loading standards for lodgepole pine forests, for ponderosa pine forests, and then for mixed conifer forests. And so we utilized those as our target objectives for wood loading. We're still at the point of, figuring that out and balancing it with HRV and really coming up with that wood budget and wood loading. And we're really, it's not a perfect model yet, but that's where we're striving to get to.
Pam, I see your comment in the chat that you suggest that we talk to BMFP about monitoring after prescribed fire, and I can imagine that we'll be having those conversations. So are there any other questions that people want to ask?
This is Frances Preston, and I just put one in the chat.
Mark, I see your hand as well. Why don't you just jump in, and then Francis, you can ask your question after Mark.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I put it in the chat. Maybe it doesn't show. I'm not very good at this. Anyway, I was curious. It's a great presentation. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. How would you do things differently, if at all, with a new project? I'm just curious about lessons learned.
Actually, Mark, we were saving your question for last, but since you
Okay,
asked
I
it,
thought we were done, so good, thanks.
does anybody want to start with that one?
Well, I was going to say just first for Francis's question, I'm not sure that we don't, I mean, it would be a real shame to not get this this data collection done over time, because I think that it could be a really valuable data set and, you know, lessons learned on following, you know, quantitatively. So many projects get followed sort of qualitatively. This is a really, I think it would be a shame with all the work that has gone into it that it wouldn't get followed quantitatively. And I think the Ecology Group, although I'm no longer in that group, but Amarina is a really good colleague of mine, and she's taking over. And I would hope that she would keep this going as far as the vegetation monitoring piece in the shade. I don't know if I don't think there's any like legal consequences or anything like that for not monitoring. This is the part of the management side that I'm not as familiar with. We do have some requirements for monitoring, but I don't think it's to the level of what we're doing here. Amanda or Bob, you can probably answer that.
I actually couldn't see Francis's question for some reason.
Her question was just what happens if we don't get the monitoring done on the overall objectives of the project?
Okay. I don't know that I have much to add to that.
So this is Francis. So having had a 46-year career with the Forest Service, I know that monitoring is very difficult to get funding for. So I guess I'm very curious, even still today, why we say we're going to, and we don't. And is there a way by which professionally we can work into projects some method of monitoring that goes along with the money that we get to do the daily work? And if there isn't, why don't we just say we're not going to monitor? Because for some projects, it's very important to have the results of the monitoring. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Mark, were you going to respond to that? I see your hand up. Otherwise, I do want to make sure we're on time. And if the
Yeah, just a quick suggestion to Francis. Maybe Francis, you and I could work on a Title II proposal when those become available and put in funds for monitoring this particular project. So we should follow up.
That's a great suggestion, Mark.
Mark, yeah, that is a great suggestion, because most of the data that needs to be collected can be done by seasonal employees, and it's that funding that we lack a lot of the time.
I think it would be a great, there we go. I think now's a great time to answer your question, Mark. What are some of the lessons learned? And I would offer, if the panelists could each take this one at a time, that would be great. I'm happy to call on people. You want to start us out, and then we'll go to Amanda, Bob. Go ahead, Pack.
Okay, sure, yeah. Yeah, I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about the basal or the baseline data. It would be nice to have several years of baseline data, because natural systems vary annually. And so right now, what we have for baseline is just a snapshot in time. And it would be nice to have a few years that we were literally collecting data as the crews were coming in behind us felling. So that wasn't possible with this project. But that would be something we would try to do over probably. The other thing, for the shade, we noticed that the solar Pathfinder was actually, I think it was actually developed for industry, like for to measure solar on solar panels and things. I think it was first used for non-resource based things, and now it's, we're finding it to be really useful. But the way, we didn't think about this at the time, but the actual dome sits on a tripod that's about maybe like 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And so when this little creek is pretty small, and so when we're talking 2 to 3 feet, it's actually above the surface of the water that we're measuring the shade. And when Amanda and Bob were walking through recently, they were just making the observation that a lot of times you get shade right on the surface. There's just downed wood or branches or whatever right at the surface. And so the solar Pathfinder could have missed a lot. But that doesn't, all that's going to do is add to the variability, but we might have actually gotten some higher shade readings potentially, but that might, or at least it would be more accurate if we could get the reading down at the surface.
I guess I can go next. When you're, planning and implementing a project like this, it takes a lot of time. And one of the things that Bob mentioned the other day about something that he learned is when we were training crews to do the tree felling, they did a really great job, but they started out falling the larger trees first. And when you do that, you bury the smaller trees. And after a while, that becomes pretty evident. And I think we had trees that should have been cut, smaller trees, granted, but trees that nevertheless should have been cut by the prescription, and they got missed because they got buried in the branches and the tops of the big trees. And so, just be able to think through that and start with cutting the small stuff and then cutting the large stuff. And that's just a little nuance to the implementation. I know that for me, looking at the openings, it is a lot of material. When I was out there just after they got done doing the treatments, like it was really hard to even move around out there because it's so much. And it really does kind of open my eyes to like what the area is going to look like when all of it's completed, because these were just the openings. We still have the variable density thinning to complete as well. And, kind of what implications that has for the riparian areas. And just knowing, that at least for me, when I look at it, I think, there's plenty of wood here to meet our riparian management objectives and to, just put a lot of wood into the creek. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be doing. But there's also going to be a lot more that we could, there is a commercial product there, and it might not be appropriate in every reach, but there are some areas where it would probably be appropriate to remove some of that as well. I would say that, like for me, I'm not definitely a riparian scientist, but it would be nice, I think, to have more, a couple more years of pre-data, especially for the stream temperature. And then, obviously we're going to be collecting more post-treatment data, but it would just be nice to be able to see some more of the trends before we started doing any treatments. And I think that's all I have. Bob, if you wanted to share some of your lessons learned as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Amanda. When I shared these water temperature charts with my DEQ contact, and he did talk a lot about that variability in the water temperatures. And really where we ended up landing is, if we do choose to do a future study like this, maybe try to pick a spot that has, maybe 5 to 10 years of pre-water temperature data. And that might be able to tease out the noise better. on some of those things, because there is, inherent variability year to year. And that's one of the biggest signatures we do have, is the variability out here. Regarding shade, it's not something that I would do differently, but I learned a lot by looking at our pre-shade and post-shade, and so our contemporary forest practices, we're moving shades from 85% down to, 75% with what was perceived as a pretty aggressive opening treatment. And 70% was our shade standards according to our forest plan for the systems. And I thought that we would have a short-term impact to shade from some of these treatments, and we didn't from this. And so just learning that really opened up my eyes. Spent some time talking with a fire ecologist, Carrie Kemp, about, the down wood that we had out there. And she was concerned. And she was concerned that we had accumulated a whole lot of 1,000-hour fuels on the forest floor, and what that might do if it did catch on fire and perhaps burn some of the seed beds in the soil that perhaps, we wanted to somehow release. And so really finding that balance in the down wood, as well as how much we leave out there, it is still something that I think we're thinking about and trying to find that balance for. And then the treatments, I really wish we could have had the treatments, the veg treatments followed with prescribed treatments, really elegantly mapped out and lined out so we could understand those treatment effects. Like Amanda said, we had the openings, and that was the big thing we were monitoring. The variable density might have done a little bit more around the edges. And so it would have been nice to have done that complete treatment. But we did do, some of the most aggressive aspects of it. So that's something. And then when we went out there with the wildlife biologist, she was really interested in knowing what our vision was for some of this riparian thinning. She was new to the team. And so we said, hey, go take a look, Mariah, go look out at Big Mosquito. That's where we did some of our pilots. And so Mariah was poking around out there, and she really saw a change in the food web from a wildlife standpoint. She saw that the downwood is contributing to more, critters down there underneath on the forest floor from the wildlife standpoint. And then she was telling us, that the variability in the canopy and the openings, that created more of these foraging areas. And so we really started understanding maybe a little bit more about wildlife as well. And it would have been neat if we had, unlimited resources, or the folks who were able to maybe also look at the wildlife side of some of these treatments and continue to monitor some of those things. And thank you. And that's the conclusion of my pieces.
Thank you so much for this presentation today. This was really wonderful. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. If you still have questions, please let me know. You can send me an email, and I can make sure our panelists get them and get some of your questions answered. I'm going to share my screen one more time and finish up today's workshop. So thank you for participating. Our next workshop and our final workshop of the series is integrating wildfire risk reduction, landscape restoration, and climate adaptation across Eastern Washington. That's held on October 6th at 1 p.m. For more information on the series, please visit our website. There's recordings of each webinar, so if you missed one, you can go and watch one. If you have any more questions, please reach out to me. My contact information is at the bottom of the screen. You'll receive a post-workshop email from me either later today or by tomorrow, end of day, that will have the link to this recording as well as a post-workshop survey. So we would really appreciate if you take 5 minutes of your day to fill out that survey. It helps us advocate for funding for this webinar, as well as we incorporate your feedback into every workshop we do. So they can only get better, and that's only if you provide us some feedback. So we'd really appreciate that. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you for coming. I will, at this point, I do think I have to limit the breakout rooms for now. So have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Thank you for having us.